Welcome to Thrive, your agency resource, the only podcast for creative, media, and technology leaders who are ready to dive deeper into conscious leadership and agency growth. I'm your host, Kelly Campbell. Thrive is brought to you by Accessity, the leading web accessibility solutions provider. Join thousands of agencies that are already incorporating web inclusivity into their service offerings. Visit accessity.com today. So welcome to another episode of Thrive. Last time we were together, LaTanya Wilkins and I had a really great discussion about leading below the surface. I hope you had a chance to pick up her book. And on this episode, we're going to sort of continue with the theme of building an equitable workplace. I'm joined by Rhodes Perry, a DEI consultant, speaker, podcast host, and author of two books. The most recent one being Imagine Belonging, which you can check out and hopefully purchase at imaginebelonging.com. But Rhodes, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you on and to just talk about this amazing book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, Kelly. And I love LaTanya too, so I'm super happy that she was on your show last week.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago. So would you do us the favor or the honor of kind of sharing your personal experience that led you to do the particular brand of DEI work that you do in the world?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm now kind of 20 years into my career. And before I started my own business, I worked in many different organizations, mostly in nonprofit and government agencies. And as a trans person, many of those organizations starting 20 years ago weren't super aware on how to be gender inclusive. So even though I was hired to do budget work or policy work or organizational development work, oftentimes I had another job. And that job was just to try to create some space for me. And as I look at generations to come, how can I make each of these organizations I worked in just a little bit more inclusive for the next generation of trans or non-binary people? And, in the beginning, I felt like, this is emotional labor. I was slightly I wish people already had these answers. And I realized, if not me, who, right? And so I grew into that role of enjoying it in some ways. I was like, I think I'm good at kind of making connections and helping people understand that when we make these changes for a certain group of people, it actually helps a lot of people out. And I think a classic example is when you look at kind of all user restrooms. It's great for trans people. It's also fantastic for parents with young kids of different genders. It's great for people who have mobility challenges, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of that universal design concept. And that's kind of how I got started. And I'm grateful for the experience. My younger self might have been a little more grumpy about it, but if I only knew what I know now, I might have had a different attitude, first getting started in that kind of work.
Right. Well, that's actually an interesting segue to another question or curiosity that I had. There's a lot of content in this book, which was slightly surprising to me, like pleasantly surprising, about self-actualization in the book. And it's a thing that a lot of people don't necessarily talk about. You could have heard it discussed or described as self-mastery, personal development work. I might even put it in the realm of like shadow work or trauma healing, right? Because that's my work in the world. But I was surprised at how much content about self-actualization was in the book. So can you talk a little bit more about the idea of examining maybe your own power to change things as specifically for our audience, for agency leaders?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in the book, the third chapter talks a lot about power, right? And kind of the fact that it's all around us, and yet at the same time, even writing about it, like, wow, this is challenging. And just for folks not familiar with the book, I was really looking at sources of social power, and so I looked kind of deep into kind of the social sciences of like, what are people saying about this? And what I learned is there's kind of a conventional model of 6 sources of social power. 3 of those are holding, positional power. So you're like a capital L leader in your organization. And the other 3 are kind of things that we can develop. Like an example is expert power. Any of us, say you want to learn how to paint, acrylic painting or something like that, you can grow that kind of expert power by taking a class, doing self-study, talking to other people who have already mastered that trade, that craft, that art. and you can grow it. So I wanted to connect that into doing DEI work where, sure, there are people hopefully in your agencies that are leading the work, if not you as kind of like the head of your agency. And also to recognize that it's going to take all of us to build those workplaces where each of us feels supported, seen, connected. We feel pride in what we do. We feel purpose. And so recognizing that you do have that kind of power to make that transformation. So where the self-actualization comes in is to first recognize those sources of power, even if you feel so far removed from, being the agency leader of your organization, you still have that ability and that influence to make a difference with the people you directly work with. And I want any reader, this is largely for folks on that journey to build up their skills to be inclusive leaders, but I want anyone who can pick up this book to locate themselves in reading it, to be like, oh, wait a second, I do have more power than I'm giving myself credit for. So I can be a part of this work, right? So it's an invitation to come into it. And I really enjoyed that because there's some ownership that people can have. And yeah, so it was fun to write about that.
The other thing that I like that you just said was talking about this in the context of being invitational, or it being an invitation, because I think so much DEI work has historically been focused on, like, we've got to check these boxes. Latanya and I talked about this a little bit in the last episode. We've got to check these boxes. We've got to make sure that everything looks a certain way on the veneer. But if we're being invitational about it, it's not policy. It's not, hey, we have to do this. It's we get to do this, right? Yes. And so that kind of invitation to say, hey, could you look at your own unconscious biases, or could you, we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of legacy, but what kind of organization do you want to actually be leading and building? So I love the invitational quality of that.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for diving so deep into the book too. So it's, I was like, yeah, chapter 3 was really good. Yeah, it's absolutely an invitation. And just getting to that checking of the boxes, right? Which I'm sure you all discussed that pretty deeply. With this book in particular, one of the main reasons why I wrote it is because a lot of the organizations that I work with are kind of looking at those short-term kind of quick wins of how can we radically transform our culture, and they're only looking at it in like quarter to quarter. And I'm like, okay, that's you need those short-term goals to keep moving. Right. But what is your long-term vision for the kind of culture you want to move into, that you desire and that you crave? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like on a full sensory level? And when I pose that question to leaders, there's often like that kind of pregnant pause. And then it's almost kind of an overwhelm, because there's maybe the cynicism or not giving yourself permission to get in that really creative space of really like, what could this look like? Right. And how would it be different compared to what is right now? So usually where I start with leaders to set that kind of vision is the first kind of name the kind of culture that they have. What are you up against? What are the things that are going well that you're really proud of, and taking a long, hard look in the mirror, like, what are those things that maybe have been brought to your attention by those that you're leading? And what do you want to do to change that? And that's almost kind of like in kind of the art space, you're drawing the negative space of like, okay, now we're going to push that away. And you can start to then see kind of those glimmers of that long-term vision. And I think that's so essential of where to start. So that, like anything else, if you have a marketing campaign, what success looks like, right? And like if you're on that course to get there, and what those kind of short-term metrics are that will help you achieve that success. Mm-hmm. And I want to get leaders in that mindset. You can do this with DEI work. It doesn't have to be abstract or overwhelming, and it also doesn't have to be limited. Where we did an unconscious bias training, we're good. It's like it's an ongoing journey. And it can be manageable, right? And that's why you bring in experts to help you with that. I really want to help. I really wanted this book to help leaders kind of overcome one of those common reasons why DEI goals fail, which is that lack of that long-term vision.
Did you know that 1 out of 5 people in the US is living with some form of disability? I'm proud to partner with Accessity as they work toward the mission of making the web accessible to everyone. It's time to prioritize inclusivity. Ensure that your own website and your client sites can be accessed by all and that they're ADA compliant. Head over to accessity.com/thrive to learn more about their agency partner program. Now, back to the show. Okay, so that was actually part of my other curiosity, was maybe not so much about why it fails so often, but maybe when you're working with clients over the course of your career, what is like the most common, I guess I would call it maybe like a pushback, or you said skepticism before. Like, what is the most common thing that you hear when you're talking with folks about making inclusion and equity a priority, and they automatically have that reaction of like, no, and here's why it's not going to work? Like what comes up like more often than anything else?
Yeah. I think that there's a skepticism. There's also a fear, and the most common thing, and it's not necessarily said, it's kind of in the nonverbals, but it's a fear. And on the surface, what that fear looks like is fear of change. We're going to change, we're going to move away from the status quo. In the reality of what's not said, and what I have to kind of speak to directly, is that fear of loss. I think that those who benefit from the status quo, people who holds a dominant identity, maybe a number of dominant identities, feel that if they create targeted interventions that will improve the workplace experience for those who are least likely to feel safe just showing up in the workplace, that somehow they lose their power or their position of authority. And in reality, and this is what I often lead with, is when we talk about like legacy, like there's three really big things that for you as a leader, you're going to benefit from. In the era of the Great Resignation, your staff are more likely to stay if they feel connected to your organization. Your bottom line, there's enough research out there. Just if you're skeptical about how this is good for business, I think there's one drama stat I really love. And this is for like big corporations, but for every like $250,000 that you spend in investing in kind of DEI work, you save in retention and recruitment costs alone, and also kind of litigation, when things do go sideways, $2 million. So you do the math. Like, I think that that's a pretty good investment. But most importantly, what people say about you when you're out of the room, when you think about your legacy as a leader, you're going to be remembered for doing the right thing. And I think for a lot of heart-centered leaders, for a lot of purpose-driven leaders, that's a good thing, So I think that fear of loss is something that is it's an unfounded fear, and it's a real fear. And I think we have to speak to that specifically. And so that's what I see come up. That comes up a lot. And I think another thing is the lack of, and for agency leaders that are connected to your work, looking around and seeing success, looking at other agencies and not seeing those examples, because too often we're not documenting our success and sharing it with our peers, So I do my best when I'm working with a client of thinking about similar organizations that have gone on this path, but maybe a decade before, maybe a couple decades before. A really great example is like Sodexo. In the 80s and 90s, they were experiencing a lot of class action lawsuits around racial and gender discrimination. Like, they were in trouble. And a really great DEI thought leader, Mary Frances Winters, her consulting firm worked with them for decades, and massive turnaround. They're one, if you do kind of a Google search on them, they're always on the top list of great places to work, DEI, like they win a lot of awards because they're doing the work. And they have that long-term vision, and they're set on, this is an ongoing journey, and we're not going to ever stall out or stop this work. And it's a classic example of change management. Like, if you want, and I would say transformation management, if you want to transform your culture, we're talking about a decade or two to start seeing those indicators of success on a consistent basis. And it's, how do we maintain the stamina? Like, I think that's the biggest thing, and so that requires a lot of coaching. And I think those examples of other organizations doing this work and being successful, and also showing where they've stumbled, that kind of generates courage that I think is really needed in leaders to do the work well.
Oh, for sure. Courage. Yeah. Is it ever off-putting in your experience on the leader or leadership team when they hear this is going to take like a decade or more? It is ongoing work. It's an ongoing investment. It's something that you've got to put into your line items, just like you would a marketing expense. Do you kind of, are you on the receiving end of like surprise as a reaction to that?
Sometimes I think with the executives that come in with recognizing that, I mean, they're on their own journey. So I think where I start is just kind of wherever they're at with their development, and everybody's in a different place, is kind of recognizing, think about where you are today, with just talking about inclusive leadership skills versus where you were 10 years ago. What was that journey like? And, I think for most people, it's like, oh, I've learned so much. I've learned so much over the past 2 years. It's like, right. So imagine where you're going to be in the next 10 years. And you're just one person, and our organizations are made of groups of people. So if we have similar goals for our organization, what will be the benefit? Trying to get them in that mindset of how things could be really different if they're living in that culture. That's a culture where they can show up as who they are. They can feel more connected to the people that they're working with. They can get what they need so they can do their best work. It's the investment and trying to get them in that mindset. So I have a background in economics. So I think sometimes it's, thinking about compound interest or talking about it in the way of money, and people are like, oh yeah, I get that. So, and usually like where that kind of pushback comes from is with people that they're not working with teams of other people in a way, so because this is an investment. So trying to get people who are chief financial officers to see like how this is going to benefit you and your work. And I think that's really fun because inevitably, this, and some of the work that I do with leadership development, it's really giving you a set of skills so you can work more effectively with the people you work with each and every day. And who doesn't want more kind of like tools in their tool belt just to like, this is not going to work. Let me try this other skill of like repairing from harm or whatever it is. And I think people really appreciate that.
Just kind of shifting for a second, there was, I think it was someone provided a testimonial about the book, and you had it on your website. And there was this one line that, I don't know, just kind of like jumped out for me. Someone said, the power of culture can drive us to behavior that violates our own values. So I just wanted to talk about this idea for a second, because I think this is where, from my perspective, this is where I think there's a little bit of a gap in the realms of self-awareness, right? We don't realize as leaders some of the things that we're bringing into that leadership style, right?
Yes.
That are impacting the culture and that are actually pushing our employees away. And I wonder if some of those behaviors, maladaptive behaviors, right? If they're violating our own values as leaders, because we don't actually want to lead in this particular way, in this kind of toxic way, or this way that focuses on profit above all else. I think it may also be true of people who are within that culture, within that organization, that they have to sort of subscribe or ascribe to the cultural norms, right? And that in and of itself, we can start to violate our own values. So I thought it was a really powerful kind of sentence or a statement. And I just wanted to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, I love that.
Anything that's like a little provocative, I'm like, I'm going to pull that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think it's that pressure to quote unquote fit in, so there's a whole, in the first part of the book is talking about the way that we lead and the influence of culture. And we do it because it's protective, right? If you're thinking about your career, so maybe not for the agency owners, you get to kind of create the culture that you want to have. And sometimes we're doing that on autopilot. So I'm sure LaTanya talked about that, implicitly, we just kind of build it because our culture has been transferred to us, those transferable sets of beliefs and behaviors that have allowed us to survive. It's allowed our social group to survive. So if we're not careful, those beliefs and behaviors that have been handed to us, what it means to be professional, what it means to be a leader, right, may violate when we think about our own values. I don't want to be paternalistic. I don't want to be like, there's only one right way to solve this problem. Yet, when we think about those values of professionalism, perfectionism, right, either or thinking, these are the things that can really cause a lot of harm. So doing that work, whether it's diving much deeper than just unconscious bias, but really doing the work on understanding where you hold power in certain situations and where you don't, right? And that's going to change, right? It's going to change based on the environment that you're in, whether it's virtual or in person. It's going to change on the constellation of people that surround you, right? And how can we be more mindful about being open to leading in different ways that are going to be like we talked about that invitation, inviting people in. It's going to allow people to feel more seen, more connected and supported. And we're moving away from that sting of exclusion, which is that feeling of being invisible or feeling disengaged or discouraged. Sometimes we feel shame because it's like, I don't feel like I can be myself in this environment. So I'm going to almost like brutally extract the things that are most precious to me in order to go along, to get along, to fit in, to get ahead in my career.
Right.
And at some point, what does that cost to you? Even if you are leading effectively and you're getting rewarded, but you're running afoul of who you are, you know, and over time that definitely, you know, I've been there, and I'm sure, you know, 75% of us cover in some way at work. And that there's a big cost to that over time. It might not be initially. So I guess
May
like
not also be conscious all of the time, right?
yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of times it's unconscious until, you know, maybe even just kind of watching this podcast, this interview, maybe some of your viewers are like, oh yeah, I've been there, and whoa, like I'm now thinking about it. And there's ways that I don't even recognize that this is happening. But, you know, it's really getting leaders to kind of think through this big question, which is kind of like who are we intentionally including, and maybe even ourselves, how are we intentionally kind of showing up, and then who might we be unintentionally excluding. And that question, that's the question of like, what do we need to do to answer that question? And that requires a lot of reflection on each person and in the work that we have to do individually to kind of get around that. So
I think a good start is using this or looking at this book as almost like a guide or a playbook or a workbook in some way, just as an entrance into it. So just kind of as we start to wrap up, I want to go back to this idea of legacy, because I think it's really important. So thinking about like what kind of leadership legacy you want to be known for as it relates to building an equitable organization. What would you kind of like add to that or expand upon sort of as your last knowledge bomb that you're going to drop?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question. And I think it's in the way that I framed it in the book too, it's kind of like, I remember someone was asking me that question. I was like in my late 20s and I'm like, wait, I'm sorry, what? I'm like, I'm still trying to get my career started here. But it was a great question, you know, and I thought about it, and in that moment, it's like, oh, I guess I'm building the legacy as I go, you know? So I would share with your viewers, you know, how would you describe your legacy now? You know, if you're not in the room, how would your colleagues talk about you in general and the way you show up as you lead? And when it comes to this work, right, like doing that personal work of who might I be unintentionally excluding, and what am I actively doing about that now? And I think if you show up and you practice to practice, right, like that's kind of my mantra when I do this work, just practice to practice, know that you're going to fumble, know that you're going to make mistakes, know that sometimes doing this work might feel a little awkward, but when you continue to do it, those actions are noticed. The worst thing that any of us can do is we're so fearful that we're going to mess up and make a mistake or cause offense. We remain silent and we do nothing. That also goes noticed, right? So going back to the courage that you're talking about, right? Like find the courage just to kind of say, you know what? I'm not perfect. No one wants me to be. I'm going to break up with perfectionism and I'm just going to keep trying, you know, like that's what I would say. And that will significantly help your legacy because people will remember those stories. Like my agency leader, you know, like spoke about how they connect to this work. They shared a personal story. Like just doing that, you might think that that's not professional, or what would I say? I don't even feel connected to this work. This is not for me to do. It's for all of us to do. This is like the human experience. So how do you connect to this work? And taking that right risk of sharing your story, boom, like that's how you start. And that's how you start to build your legacy around being viewed as an inclusive leader. So practice to practice.
Yeah. And what you're talking about is conscious leadership, right? And specifically modeling vulnerability, right? Yes. So giving permission for everyone else to say, oh, okay, yeah. Breaking up with perfectionism, I think is great, but also breaking up with professionalism, right? Because yes, I get that there's a line and that there are certain things that have historically been on one side of the line of professional, and some on the other side. But I think that there's so much more of a blur now between what does that look like. I think all of us can understand that maybe we don't show up in like a sports bra and like shorts to work, right? Like that's not professional. But being able to tell a personal story, I just think that it's time to model that vulnerability, especially from the leadership perspective, because that's going to trickle down exactly what you said before. And that's the kind of organizations that I would hope that most of us would want to be leading, where people feel like we do good work, we're all here rowing in the same direction, getting great work done, right? But our interactions in this culture, as we're getting said work done, if we can be ourselves, we can be authentic. We don't have to hide who we are. We can talk about our partners of the same gender. We can talk about our non-binary children, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
That's, I would think, and I would hope that that's the type of environments that especially creative and technology agencies want. Right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. 100%. And just kind of adding, that's the future workforce. When we think about Gen Z, the next generation after Gen Z, Generation Z is craving this. They're looking for leaders that are modeling how to show up fully. And that includes the vulnerability component, and there's greater trust that's built, right? And there's also, when we think about those foundations of belonging, trust is huge, right? As well as this concept of psychological safety. Am I safe enough to ask for help when I need it, admit to a mistake when I make one, offer constructive feedback when I have it, without fear of negative consequences? Like, that's, younger generations want that in the workplace. And so if we can start to create that container for it as conscious leaders, as inclusive leaders, you will be ahead of this game of recruitment right now. And you'll have, I can promise you, your retention numbers, the loyalty that your staff have will increase significantly. So yeah.
You've seen it with your clients. I've seen it at my former agency. I've seen it with my clients. There's, and that's just the two of us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's so much evidence, anecdotal and in research, and, pick up any book that's been published pretty much in the last year and a half or so.
Yeah.
The examples are just astounding. This is the way. This is like, I'm not in favor of like, there's only one path. That's not who I am. But in this case, like, for me, conscious leadership, inclusive leadership, this is the way forward for sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Rhodes, thank you so much. I love talking with you. I really appreciate your time and the fact that we were able to get together today.
Yes, thank you. This was great. Thank you, Kelly.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to subscribe wherever you watch or listen. And a final note of gratitude to the official sponsor of Thrive, Accessity, the leading web accessibility solutions provider. Learn more about the win-win proposition and keep your clients' websites inclusive and compliant. Be sure to check out their partner program for your agency today at accessity.com/thrive.